before you started assigning people that project, you literally would list out what are the strengths of the people that I'm going to need to make this project come to life.
Brand is not something you bolt on at the end. Brand is like, what is your DNA? Do you have a favorite interview question?
It probably comes from personal bias, but I like for people to explain a time when they had to learn something completely new. What I like to do instead is host like an open Q&A. I think you learn a lot about somebody in that environment and the kinds of questions they ask.
When you hire somebody, how do you make that first couple weeks as successful as possible?
It's people first, as soon as possible, helping them build relationships because the rest will come.
Welcome to How I Hire, the podcast where we talk with senior go-to-market leaders about how they find, vet, attract, and grow new talent. Today, I'm joined by Karrie Sanderson. Karrie is an experienced CMO, having worked at some amazing brands in consumer, like Coke, Starbucks, and Pfizer, and tech, Smartsheet, Typeform, and now LiveRamp. Karrie's now working as CMO, Chief of Staff to CMO at LiveRamp, and Karrie and I have known each other for a long time, and I love talking about careers. So Karrie, welcome.
Thank you so much, Andy. I really appreciate you inviting me to this podcast.
That's awesome. Well, we're going to dive deep today around maybe we start with not just the experience at LiveRamp, but across all of your experiences, really focusing in on senior talent. How do you think about roles? Do you post roles? How do you think about hey, I've got a new role. How do you build that role out, think about it, and then how do you start that process of searching? Because we all know that people often blow you up if you post a role. So how do you think about that? And if you have a specific one, I love to go deep on specific roles.
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing is, if there's a senior level role open, right, that's often unfortunate because you probably lost some really good talent. So, but it's also an opportunity to really, I think as a marketing leader, think about your organization, because when you have something like that get pulled out of the organization for whatever reason, it's important to think there's a moment in time to think, do I need to make some changes to my organization? Mm-hmm. Is this the right role? Am I just going to, routinely backfill it? And that may be the case, but I always first like to start a little ways back and understand, is this still the right role? So it's a time for reflection and a time for evaluation. And if it is, you want to replace that same role, you've done that evaluation, then for me, it's a chance to really think about the team that exists. So, because I feel like when you get to a senior level, the function, the discipline, the domain expertise, you're going to find that generally, no matter who you place, it becomes then about team dynamics, right? So if I'm building out my leadership team, I'm looking for where's a skill set that we're lacking that's maybe something like a soft skill or a deep dive domain expertise or an industry expertise or something like that, where in addition to the function that I want them to perform, maybe there's a gap I need to fill. Maybe I've got a lot of people who spike high in drive and get things done, and not a lot of people on my team who are full of wonder and invention, so some of those soft dynamics, I always like to make sure that I'm really thinking that through. And then,
sorry, go ahead, please.
Go ahead.
I said, how do you think about I know at the junior level, we all love athletes, but as you get to the senior level, how do you think about, have they done this 3 times before versus do they have this amazing aptitude to take on new challenges all the time?
I think it's a little bit of both, right? To me, the athlete is, you've had to make it through those hurdles as a junior person to get to a more senior level. So chances are you already have that in you. And there's ways I'm going to pressure test that based on, if you worked at a challenging company or if you worked in an industry that has a lot of constrictions on it. I worked in pharmaceuticals. It's very hard to market in pharmaceuticals because of all the legal restrictions. If you can be successful there, you can do a lot more. Those types of tests, they have a variety of experiences. But I think when you get to a senior level, this idea of, needing to be able to move into where you're managing teams and oftentimes managing teams of teams. And there's skills there that are different than if you're an individual contributor or even a director level manager, where you still have to really focus in on the domain expertise. So again, it depends upon the level of the role, if it's a VP or an SVP versus a director, but it depends. A lot of it depends, but I think the first thing I try to do is look for some of that. Where's my gap across my leadership team? What's the dimension that maybe it's a competency or a soft skill that's missing? and make sure that whoever I'm working with, whether it's an internal recruiter or an external recruiter, is thinking about that. One example of that, actually, and this is something you mentioned earlier in the introduction, that I used to work at Coca-Cola. And one of the things, like every job you have, you take something with you to the next job that kind of becomes ingrained in you. And Coca-Cola is really big on strength-based team building. And so we did the Marcus Buckingham, first break all the rules, now discover your strengths. And what I love about it is, like, really the only time you're expected to be good at everything is in high school, right? Like, you got to get an A in everything, but that's not how the real world works in general. Like, I tend to be more of a strengths-based leader where, I'll spend some time in your review talking about, like, these are things you should work on, but I tend to be more like, what are the strengths you have that we can really unlock and leverage? I think that's very true in hiring as well. So to bring that example to life, what might be missing, if I've got a lot of maximizers and strategists and things on my team, but I might be missing, some other dimension that needs to happen, I look for people who can fill in that gap. Because at Coca-Cola, we took it to the nth degree. When there was a special project that had to be done, before you started assigning people that project, you literally would list out, what are the strengths of the people that I'm going to need to make this project come to life? And then you would assign people based on their strengths. And you'd build these really sometimes quirky and unexpected teams, but they worked really well together because there wasn't a lot of overlap of what people were really good at trying to fight, or trying to resolve the way they did that thing. And I think about hiring the same way, which is where is that? So as I'm thinking about senior leadership, I think it's extra important that you build out a leadership team that's diverse so that the team that works for them can see themselves in some leader, even if it's not their direct leader, but some leader on that leadership team resonates with them. They can see that there's success that can be had no matter what your personal strengths and styles. And I think it makes for a more effective leadership team in general.
I love that. I listened to one of your other podcasts where you talked about the Coke training side. Yeah. And I guess the question I would have is there a profile that resonates with you? So I'll tell you this story that I've always thought, which is I love people that have been at big and seen great pattern recognition, and then have also are a little scrappy and have been small. But is there, maybe not the Coke background specifically, but is there a profile where you're like, I really like candidates that fit that profile, or something where you're like, I'm just looking for it?
I think you have to know yourself really well. Like I want someone who is and there's a term that I've been exposed to here at LiveRamp. It's from the Table Group. It's that they're like a consulting company that does kind of the 5 dysfunctions of a team. But one of the things that we do here is we talk about the ideal team player. And that resonated with me really well, because the ideal team player is humble and they're hungry and they're smart. And smart doesn't necessarily mean like IQ. It also means like EQ, smart, right? And so there's got to be a level of humbleness to you that you don't know everything. I look for people who are willing to say, I don't know. I look for people who are willing to be curious, but at the same time, they're hungry, right? It's just like you want to look for a pattern where did you just apply the same framework to the last 4 jobs? Because to me, it can be effective, but can it be groundbreaking? Can it be revolutionary? Can it step change where you're going through business? If you're kind of looking at every problem, trying to fit it into the solution that you know. And then smart. I mean, smart is both, intelligence, but also organizationally, because you can have, and we've all probably run across people in our career who are book smart, but have a hard time affecting change management and affecting the kind of impact and results that you want to, because of challenges they may have working with other people or working across the company or cross-functionally. So I think that was probably the most, I say hungry, humble, and smart all the time now, because it's something that I feel like encapsulates that. But the definition for me, everybody has a personal definition, but for me, those are my definition of that.
I truly love that. I think it's one of the what you just described is the maturity of a candidate in so many ways. I'm curious. I love how the culture of the company has blended into how you interview. And I spent a lot of time thinking about that with Culture Amp, and we'll talk about that more in the kind of employer brand side, which I'm sure you've got some great thoughts on. But I'm curious, like, how much of that is LiveRamp's culture that's there, or has that been consistent throughout your career? Because it's neat. Like, would you, if you were at a different company, be looking for a slightly different skill set and and cultural interview when you're doing that?
Yeah, no, I think what it was is hearing that gave a name to something that I've been intuitively doing, right? I've also always had this like hire for attitude, train for skill. I feel like it's hard to train somebody to be curious. It's hard to train someone to be, to look for cues and how they work with other people and try to know when to be flexible and when to hold the line. The skill part you can learn. And I'm kind of a walking demonstration of that. Like there's some skills that I bring to the table that have transferred for me, whether or not I was an engineer, whether or not I was selling paper products, or whether or not I was working at Coca-Cola or Starbucks and, all over the place now in tech. I think the skills and the discipline of that industry or that vertical or whatever that might be, those you can learn, right? If you're willing, if you're curious and you're hungry. But I think there's a attitude involved. So I used that's a Southwest thing that I stole, which is like hire for attitude, train for skill. That used to be their hiring mantra. And that felt good for a while. I use that a lot, but hungry, humble, and smart, I think are a little bit more defined. And that's something that I've exposed to at LiveRamp that feels like, oh, that's what I've meant all along. I just haven't put words to it yet.
I love it. That's so neat how the culture has shaped that. Okay, so say you've got a role, you've defined it. It's a senior level role, call it VP or up. How do you think about posting versus working through your network versus working through VCs? Like, how would you approach that, in particularly in today's market?
Yeah, well, it's definitely an employer's market right now,
it
right?
is.
And having not that long ago been looking myself and did some consulting, and then it was outreach to me here to get me to LiveRamp. I think when it's an employer's market, you can be a lot more selective about how you do that. Some companies, we're a public company, some companies have a requirement that you do have to post roles externally, right? So as a hiring manager, you just need to be aware of that and work with your internal recruiting team to give them some pretty clear guidelines that if you get 1,000, applications for a VP role in the first couple of weeks, which could happen in the current environment for a good company like LiveRamp is, you have to have a good partner in recruiting to know like only this very high bar is what I'm looking for. And then I also think that it's also time to shake the trees a little bit, right? When you become a senior marketing leader, there's a chance you belong to several communities. I know I do. I think there's 10 or 12 Slack communities I belong to that I'm participate in. Most of them have job boards or looking for hire, selectively deciding which of those you may be like, hey, I'm posting for this role. This is what I'm looking for. If you know anybody, let me know. I think that becomes effective as well to kind of get through a little bit of the trusted source. Like in those communities, if I see a job posted and I recommend someone, that's my reputation as well, right? So that the people that might be sharing a candidate are putting a little bit of their reputation on the line as well. And then, I think the last one is depending upon how unique the role is, right? If you're looking for a very specific domain expertise combined with a very specific industry expertise combined with a location, a lot more companies now are requiring someone to be in a certain city or a couple cities, like the circle gets smaller and you probably have to look for passive candidates. So knowing when to kind of call it on letting people inbound and starting to work with the agency for outbound recruiting is a little bit of art, a little bit of science, right? And it's an investment involved. But like what in these leadership roles, it's important to know when you might need that help as well and call in the reinforcements that you trust.
I love that. You touched on something which I've gone back and forth a lot on, which is, especially in this market, when you post a senior level role, you will get 2,000-3,000 applicants, the vast majority of them unqualified.
Right.
I know you and I both think a lot about brand of company. To some degree, like all these people that are applying and not hearing, most for valid reasons, some just because they didn't make it through. How do you think about the perception of, there's this thing of we want to let everyone apply, but then there's no way we can have our recruiter, they will sort through everyone, but it's hard, right? Like, and we have to make quick judgments and we have to do those things. So how do you think about like the brand perception on and I'm not talking just about LiveRamp, but I think this is a lot of what companies struggle because it's like I've applied and then I never hear back. And then I start to think badly about that brand and that company and all those things. And so, it's more of a meta thing than LiveRamp because I think every company struggles with this.
It really is. I feel like there's no excuse nowadays not to at least give somebody an automated response that says, like, there's got to be a system that says, I applied, someone looked at my resume, they put me in the no pile. That's a nice, polite way of saying, thank you so much for applying. We've had lots of applicants and you're a great candidate, but, right, fill in the blank, something that at least gives the courtesy of a response. So I feel like there's no excuse to not respond in that case. I have heard a lot of horror stories lately about how there's candidates who are super well qualified. They make it through a process. Maybe they've even done a case study or something, and then they get ghosted. Like that to me is, I'm like, I want to know who those companies are because I don't ever want to work for them, right? And I think companies have to be really careful to understand that depending upon, which pond you're fishing in, if you're fishing in the B2B CMO, SaaS, B2B SaaS CMO pond, we all know each other and we're all in a community together. And some people like to keep lists, right? So make sure that even if a candidate isn't right, be transparent with them. If something changed, let them know, like do the human thing. This is part of hungry, humble, and smart. Like do the smart thing and keep your brand healthy and whole. Versus like, don't be afraid to have that conversation. As a candidate, if someone's afraid to have that conversation with me, I'm kind of glad I'm not working there maybe, right? Because what would that experience be like if they can't even let me know I wasn't the right fit for the job? It is hard. I mean, there's so many, but I feel like that first level of like, didn't make it past the recruiter. Hopefully there's somebody working on a way to automate that response. So anyhow.
I think so. I mean, I think it's like, I kind of believe that you always should. And it's like, I've always been hiring managers. Sometimes I've been burned by the people that are like, get really angry when you do tell them that, which is, I don't know if there's a perfect answer, right? But I think it's a great brain touch point for companies. Yeah. I think your point on the early stage, I think just getting a message like you were seen, acknowledging makes a lot of sense. Your point on like getting ghosted later in process, I've seen that a lot. I think my theory on it is there's a lot of people that don't fully take the time to think through the roles in advance, like you described early on, right? They like, we need this role. And then they're like, we're going to figure it out as we go. And things are changing in the companies. And it's so hard for execs to not get
the
that.
role got pulled. I mean, current economic environments can change and be volatile and turbulent and all the things that words we've been hearing over the last couple of weeks, right? So what does that mean if you're a hiring manager? You have to be like, this is put on pause, but maybe not. It's not easy, but I think there's a level of employer brand and just human courtesy involved in letting people know and letting them know if it's a no. I think that's the hardest part, right? If you've got 2 or 3 good candidates and you make an offer to one and you're waiting to hear from them and you've got that second candidate that you'd still love to have, I mean, that's an embarrassment of riches, but you still have to be mindful about how you handle that. So that it's a good experience for all involved.
Yeah. I think you think about it the same way I do. I had a situation last week where a posted role, I reached out to my friend who was the hiring manager, and his answer was, I have had 35 backdoors on this one. And like, please just have them apply. I'm curious, like what outbound tactics work with you, right? Like, and I guess I'm giving away Karrie's secret to getting through to her. But I'm fascinated to hear, like, what if candidates, and maybe if there's a specific example or something, like where have people stood out in breaking through those walls? Or where have you done it yourself in times?
Yeah, I mean, this is hard because, sometimes you get these dark horse candidates that come out of nowhere that end up being phenomenal. But I'll always take a personal recommendation, if not maybe directly me talking to them, but I'll at least fast track them to the recruiter, right? And so when I do that kind of outbound, I haven't posted a job on LinkedIn for a really long time. Like, hey, I'm hiring. I've seen people do that for some roles, and I think their inbox probably regrets it. Whoever's managing their inbox, if it's not them. But in those closed communities where I will say I have this role open, or I know of this role that's open, or maybe a friend of mine's looking for somebody. Recently I had a friend who was looking for a senior events leader, and the really good one I know works with me, and we're not giving her up, right? So, like, how do you try to do some of that? I think that if it's a personal recommendation from one of those closed community channels, I owe it to the person that recommended the person to at least make sure that they get a look, right? And it's top of the pile. And then if we say no, a little bit more of a personalized follow-up. because you want to. It's about keeping that relationship up. It's about keeping your word. It's about your personal brand at that point as much as it is about your employer brand.
I agree. Yeah, I'm always like, I think that tactic of, hey, I'm swamped, but I will definitely copy the recruiter. I find some people are like, oh, you're not going to take the call. I'm like, no, I am swamped. And
Yeah,
so I agree with that.
yeah.
What is
And
maybe?
outbound. I mean, outbound is interesting too because like what you're getting in the sometimes the great candidates are passive candidates, right?
Mhm.
They don't know that this job's out there waiting for them because they're happily or maybe sort of happily doing whatever they're doing now, and they didn't realize that someone saw them as like, you know what, I think you'd be really good at this thing. Would you think about it? So sometimes the passive candidates, um, because they're running to something, not running from something. That's something that I always try to parse out a little bit when I am interviewing inbound, because I'm always like, are you running from something or are you running to this? And I think with passive candidates, there's less of that because they weren't looking, right? So you can kind of not worry about that too much.
Yeah, I like that. And it's fun too. The passive candidates are maybe a little, oftentimes less enthusiastic, and because they're still figuring it out themselves. And
Yeah.
so I try not to ding them in that process because you have to pull them out. Um,
Yeah, they're less likely. I think you're right there. They're less likely to rearrange their schedule to meet with somebody, and call in sick or whatever they're trying to do. Like the passive candidates can be a little tricky, but if they're the right one, they're worth it. But I think your point is early. Like, don't use enthusiasm as a criteria in the beginning because they're still trying to figure out if they want to go on a date with you, right?
yeah, I like that. How do you think about like if you're the hiring manager,
Mhm.
like when are you doing screens? How do you approach those? How do you balance interviewing versus selling, and any thoughts on those?
I take sometimes my internal recruiters, and I haven't hired for a role here at LiveRamp because I'm an independent. I don't have a team here as a chief of staff and strategy lead. But when I have been hiring teams, I probably more than most will take some screening interviews because it helps me understand. Is the recruiter that I'm working with calibrating correctly?
Mhm.
Right. So the first thing is, am I getting the caliber? Have I given them enough instruction or guidance to understand like who should we be letting through for this position? I also think hiring is the most important job that you have as a senior leader because chances are you're not doing a lot of like sort of work. Your work is to manage your leadership team so that they can manage their teams, this team of teams mentality. So an open role is like such a gift and it's a great use of my time. So I tend to do more screens than a lot of other senior leaders that I've talked about. A, for calibration, and B, just there's a vibe there, right? Like, which isn't necessarily fair, but I've never. I mean, it is, but it isn't. Like, there has to be some chemistry, and that is where I can test for curiosity and kind of get through the BS a little bit. Like, it's a little bit harder for a recruiter who hasn't done the work, who hasn't been in this marketing role, to see like, is their answer AI generated or surface sounds really good? I think I can get to, is this a person I want to move forward? In general, I tend to interview first before I send them to anybody else on
Me
my
too.
team, whether it's cross functional or somebody that will be working for them or even like in another department. I like to talk to people first before I use other people's time.
I love that. I'm the same way. If it's my role, I'm interviewing every single one. I'm happy to take 40 or 50 because I think I'm also selling. Yeah, definitely there are people out there that are like, I'm going to be the fourth or the fifth in the thing. And that's interesting to me. Do you have a favorite interview question?
It probably comes from personal bias, but I like for people to explain a time when they had to learn something completely new, right? Like,
Mm.
and not early in your career, like when something later in your career in the last year or two where you had to literally lean in and learn something new. The way that people describe their approach to something like that, I think tells a lot about, again, their curiosity, whether, their humbleness a little bit about, I had to ask for help, I don't know everything, and then what did you do with that learning and how did you apply it and how did you share it? So that I definitely, because I've had to do that so many times in my career and it's defined my success. I think it's helped my success that I want to know that they people A, realize that they don't know everything, and B, that they have this, like, the approach that they take when they do need to learn something completely new, and how they do it.
I love that one. If people haven't heard your story, I've listened to a bunch of your podcasts. It's so fun. Like your whole journey is amazing. What do you think about case studies, take homes? Like those seem to
Mhm.
be, especially in a company hiring market, they seem to everyone's doing them. They're taking a lot of time. Like how do you approach those?
It depends on the candidate, which is an interesting thing to say. But to me, if it's a candidate that I know I really want and I've done enough back channeling or I know enough about their background, I think case studies can sometimes be a bad experience for someone who is that good, that is probably being sought after by other companies. And so I'm in that case, no pun intended, I'm likely to skip the case study, right? What I'd like to do instead is host like an open Q&A, meaning if you run somebody through meet with Karrie, meet with Andy, meet with Melissa, meet with whoever, and they have these one-on-ones. I like to see how people behave in group environments, and so I have done this in the past where I've invited people to come in and be like, "We're just going to have a Q&A session. What questions do you want to ask?" We might ask you like, "What does a conversation feel like?" We can pick a topic, or they can pick the topic that they want to learn more about the company. I think you learn a lot about somebody in that environment and the kinds of questions they ask. Outside of those, really, like those kind of candidates, if you need to do a case study to test for domain expertise, maybe, or just like strategic thinking, um, I don't give them, here's our sample set of data, try that, because they're never going to know all the assumptions. It's more, tell me about something that you've done that you're proud of and walk me through how you got that done. And then again, 20 minutes on that, maybe 15, and then a half an hour or more on questions that they have for us and questions that we have for them. I'm looking for the dynamic at that point. If they've gotten that far, I probably trust their domain expertise and I'm testing for something different.
I agree with you completely. I tend to not love the case studies. I've never actually had somebody do one to me.
Yeah. And
And
if it's an employee driven market, like if talent is short, it's the surefire way to lose a great talent. When talent is scarce, you have to be very mindful about that. I mean, if you're hiring for an engineer and you need to do some coding demonstration, that's different, right? But we're not doing that in marketing, at least not yet.
I see. Well, let's jump to employer brand. I mean, Karrie and I bonded because I've always believed deeply in the power of marketing and brand, and you've led it and kind of.
Yeah.
I always think that there's three types of CMOs. There's the brand, the demand gen, the product marketing, and I've always seen you as like a brand first, but understanding all of it. Like, how do
Yeah.
you think about like, and maybe there's an experience in your past where you've gone deep on this, but how do you think about employer brand and like companies investing in it, and how do you make yourself, I know in this market it may be less important, but I'd be fascinated to hear how you think about it.
Yeah. I'll answer that question in two parts. The first one, I'll answer your question. The second one, I'm going to come back to your premise about the different kinds of CMOs.
Yeah. Let's do it.
Yeah. So I think employer brand is, especially, I think we have 4 or 5 different generations in the marketplace right now, like right now that are working, and it's evolving, right? Employer brand used to be, at least when my career started, it was like, I'm looking for a company that's stable. I'm grateful and lucky to be there. My career might be with them a very long time. So I'm looking for things like the benefits or the pension and things like that. The employer brand was about, if I'm going to give you 10, 15, 20 years or whatever it might be of my career, what am I going to get in return in terms of stability and expectations? And I think employer brands now, if you look at the generations that are entering the workforce, and I admire some of them for this, like they're a lot more selective about, what is your stance on things? What is the work-life balance? And like really tell me about what that looks like. What kind of work am I going to be doing? What kind of people am I going to be working with? So I think there's generationally the managing that, if you're in charge of employer brand, like managing those different mindsets that people have in their relationship with their employer, I think it's the first thing you have to think about. But the second thing is, I'm a big believer that who you are on the inside as a company will eventually show up on who you are on the outside. So employer brand can't be an afterthought or a special little logo, or like, let's use some of the same messaging. I mean, our customers want to know who they're doing business with and how they treat their employees. Our investors want to know, what do you stand for? Where are you investing your social capital, so to speak? So I think it's really important that you don't you don't neglect it, but that whatever you do communicate is authentic. Because if you communicate something outwardly, like this is who we are as an employer, and your internal employees read that and think, not really, that dissonance will come back to bite you. But if your regular employees are super happy and they're happy with the employer brand, they can be great for recruiting, but they're going to also show up the way you want them to show up.
I love that. I always think kind of the idea of brand is not something you bolt on at the end. Brand is like, what is your DNA? And you can't fight it. You can't hire a consultant to put a nice page out there. I think at Culture Amp, we believed your culture and your brand are like things that there's always a con to them. Like, how do you think about that? They can't be like, we are awesome, we work really hard, because there's no like, we are lazy, we are not cool. And so really being able to have those unique aspects to your brand.
And it's a really good opportunity for a CMO and a chief people officer or chief officer to work really closely together, because there's that like blurred line handoff of how are we talking about ourselves as a company when it's our customer we're talking to, but it shouldn't be completely tangential, 90-degree turn for how we talk about that to employees. So working through that with your HR person or people officer in terms of understanding, like, how do we want to work together on this? Where should we be partnering? How are we showing up in the world is really important. And then I also think it's really important if you work for a SaaS company, for sure, where a lot of your employees are in the engineering department, right? So you've got the developer relations, and so building that partnership with them as well. It was something I learned about when I was at Smartsheet and with my first foray into really tech. So having a chance to work with a developer relations person and think about, like, we want our own blog and here's what we're going to say and here's why it matters. It was this new thing that I learned, but I was like, this is really important because these are some of our most important hires, like the people who build our product. So how do we show up for them in a specific way based on that audience was another click down that we made sure that we thought about when we talked about employer brand.
I love that. Well, let's you touched on the other question I subtly asked of the different flavors of CMO. I'd love to, maybe we wrap with that one. I think that'd be a terrific one to hear how you think about the different flavors of CMO. And
I think for me that it's a useful construct to say, did somebody, are they a PM, a product marketing CMO, a brand CMO, or a demand gen CMO? I think that a better way to phrase that is like, where's their core? Where did they grow up? Like, which part of the organization did they anchor in and start in? But if you want to be an effective CMO, you need to know how to do and talk about and run all three. Yes. And it's almost like, I feel like that construct can, I don't know who invented it, recruiters maybe, like trying to explain to the CEO, like, what kind are you looking for? Well, which CMO, which CEO isn't going to say, well, of course I want the growth one, because I want to grow. But it shortchanges the fact that the CMO's job is all of those, right? You have to think through growth, but not just from a demand gen perspective, from a long-term brand perspective, and from a product marketing perspective, because your product's a big part of your brand. And that's something that I brought with me from CPG, because when I worked in CPG and I was a brand manager, I was actually a product manager. I owned the P&L. I owned what we did with the product. I had to make sure that we explained the product well, PMM. I had to make sure the brand showed up. That was brand, right? So, and I had to make sure we grew. So I don't know if that's just a construct in SaaS or what, but I do think it often sets CMOs up for failure if you're pigeonholed into one of those, because you have to know how to do all three and orchestrate them really well. And chances are your leadership team will have those core competencies, right? But depending upon, anyway, so that's a little bit of one of those things. I'm like, all three? When people say, what kind are you? I'm like, I'm all three. If you were going to get me on stage and ask me to talk about one, of course, brand is my core DNA, but no one can afford to just think about, to me, brand is everything anyway. I think it's the whole experience. So it's not arts and crafts, it's a strategic discipline. But anyway, that's one of those things that I never miss an opportunity to give my opinion on that one when I hear it. So thank you for giving me yet another opportunity to share how I think about that particular question.
I love it. I agree with you. Like, if you, especially at the larger scale, if you don't understand all three, it's like you cannot run the marketing team. And so I agree with that. What maybe final question would be like, when you hire somebody and when they're in the door, like how do you make that first couple weeks as successful as possible? And what any tactics or strategies for that?
Yeah. I it's people first, right? So as soon as possible, helping them build relationships because the rest will come. Making sure they meet all the most important people and start to develop just casual personal relationships with folks. That investment of that couple 2 to 3 weeks, oftentimes, especially if the role's been open for a while, you're like, I need him to get to work because I need this thing to happen. But just being a little bit patient, making sure they have a chance to meet their team and get to know their team on a human level, making sure they get to know their counterparts on a human level, are integrated in that way. The rest of it will come much more quickly than if you jump in really quick. Like, here's all the decks on the plan, and here's all the decks on the budget, here's all the things, and it will seem faster, but it's not. So I really do try to index on the human side first, for as much as I'm able to give myself the luxury of doing that, or the importance of doing that, before you jump too much into deliverables. I think that also gives them a chance to think about their 30, 60, 90, day plan with the right angle, coming at it from the right angle, and hearing from the people that they'll be working for and working with, and getting their perspective as they apply their expertise to the problems they start to see. They'll have more inputs about what's been tried, what's not worked, that kind of thing. So spending as much time as possible on the human side.
I love it. I love how you think about this. It's we've talked so many times in careers and about life and all this stuff, and we never really. This is a fun topic for sure. Well,
very fun. We could talk for hours. I love this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Well, thank you so much. You're one of the most thoughtful. You're my first ever guest on this. You are our number one, and it was amazing. You're so thoughtful about it.
I feel very honored to be asked for you first, and I'm sure this will be a great success. So I'm excited to hear what your future guests have to say, so I can learn from them as well.
Terrific, Karrie. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Andy.